Anthony Albanese has sustained a relatively high approval rating among voters, even amidst the latest energy crisis. Joining me live to look at the numbers, Peter Stahel, Managing Director of Essential Media, the firm tracking these figures. Thanks very much for your time. This surprised me a bit. The PM approval rating is staying really quite high, despite some recent buffeting perhaps. What is increasing though, his disapproval rating? Take us through these numbers.
Yeah, the Prime Minister is holding up well. The trend lines since the election that are of note, as you just said, is the increasing disapproval rating. But this largely matches with a decline in people who don't have a view. So I think what we're seeing here is, as we get further out from the election, as people have learnt more about the new Prime Minister and started to develop stronger views, that's what's reflecting that increase in disapproval rating. It's still a net positive rating of up in the high 30s though. Whilst that's not kind of stratospheric levels of support that you would be dancing around celebrating in the Prime Minister's office, it is, I think, a good sign given some of the difficulties that the government's facing at the moment, especially around cost of living.
Now, what's interesting as well, his net positive rating overall really high. He's still got net approval positive rating with coalition voters, but not so much independent voters. So the coalition prefer him to the independents.
Yeah, look, the majority of those independent voters there in a national sample like this are actually some of the minor parties like One Nation, Shooters and Fishers, parties like that, rather than the so-called teal independents. We can't actually separate that out with these particular numbers. But with the coalition, with the coalition voters, approval rating is often misunderstood or misinterpreted as being a support for a government. So it's not that uncommon that a coalition voter, even a strong, rusted coalition voter, would look at the performance of the Prime Minister and say, yep, he's doing what he said he would do, or yeah, I think he's performing relatively well. So we just have to be careful not to read too much into that.
Yeah, interesting, at least for now though, even if they might not love what he's doing, as you allude to there, I'm sure that's not a bad sign where he's at. Right, let's look at COP27. Voters asked if this can make a difference to climate change. Overall answer, pretty positive, and even though the Greens are pretty sort of sceptical about what our government's doing, they seem pretty happy with COP27.
Yeah, look, we haven't asked this question before, and we will ask it again. I think what we may be seeing is the beginning of some new positivity in what can be achieved on the international stage. Remember, we've had decades of these meetings and very little to show for it. But I think people are starting to hope that will change, in particular with the strengthened position of our own government in the US and so on. Hopefully, when things are delivered, we'll see a trend line start to develop about this. But the other thing to mention is that with these trend lines around international sort of decision-making bodies, people will tend to reflect on how it's actually affecting domestic policy. So it might be that a sense of positivity around the new government's direction on this is sort of reflected in these numbers.
IR changes. Again, I was a bit surprised there wasn't more criticism from coalition voters. Maybe it's something that people are slowly getting across the detail of?
Yeah, well, these aren't good numbers for the government either. So this is what's called a forced choice question, where we ask people to choose between fairly subjective assessments of this package of legislation, these reforms. Given the context of a government that was elected on a promise to increase wages and that this is really their major policy to achieve that, I would think that the government would be hoping to see their argument around these reforms being far more accepted in the public. Yes, likewise, I was surprised to see that the coalition voters' assessment was not that far off the broader public, but I'd still want to be seeing a much higher degree of support for the narrative that the government was running on these changes. We're in a cost of living crisis.
I think, just to jump in, I think we'll bring up the coalition figure there, which when they're given that choice, we'll just bring up for our viewers so they can see what you're talking about. That overall, wage growth for them, they think it'll deliver. 38% are saying that. 46% saying basically excess union power. So, as you say, they're pushed to say one of these three things. I'd suggest that's not, maybe the coalition voters aren't thinking this is as dire as the coalition MPs are just yet. But as you're about to say, if it's really a wage crisis, you'd hope the overall number we were looking at too would be much higher on the yes, this will deliver wage growth.
Yeah, this gives us an indication of how well the opposing arguments are landing with the public. And it seems to me that the public hasn't really cottoned on as well as the government might have hoped that this package of reforms is actually going to make a difference in their pockets.